Hi everyone, thank you for watching this video. I'm Andrea Gorgi, doctoral candidate number 3 of the Marie Curie project GECKO, designed for AGA-type discretization workflows, and these are the research developments up to May 2025 for the application of the shifter boundary method in structural and quantum mechanics problems. So I will start by giving a short motivation. This is the general setup of a quantum mechanics problem, where we need to solve for each of the bodies involved a set of governing equations that could be structural and thermal, for example, plus a set of inequalities constraints to prevent, first of all, compenetration of the objects and unphysical values of the stresses, and in case it is defined, the frictional law. Well, it should be clear that since most of the physics is generated by what could be a very little portion on the boundary of these objects, that we need to have a computational domain that is able to correctly capture the geometrical features of our geometries close to the contact region. This is why with standard FEM code, we are often required to define over and over the meshes that are usually defined by linear elements or even triangular elements close to that region, introducing a lot of complexity in our simulation that slow down the simulation, the numerical analysis. Well, this is exactly what led us to the question if there was a solution or a way to have this geometrical accuracy without the introduction of this complexity in the numerical simulation, to achieve accurate solutions with lower costs in the numerical simulations. Well, a first answer was the use of isogeometric analysis, which is exactly the technique to create those nonlinear elements that are able to correctly capture the features of our geometry, even with coarse meshes. But isogeometric analysis has the problem that is not easy to implement for complex geometries. It's not easy to build that nonlinear mapping in case of very complex geometries, and in general is not extendable to moving objects or very deformed domains. This is why we decided to go for an immersed method, in particular the shifter boundary method that I will shortly introduce, but also taking advantage of the good properties of the B-splines, the basis functions used by isogeometric analysis codes. So what is the shifter boundary method? The shifter boundary method, as I said, is an immersed method, and this means that we will have a completely independent background mesh from the true boundaries of our domain that will just be immersed, drawn on top of our background mesh. And then the shifter boundary method works firstly by defining a completely new computational domain, which will be the set of all the entire elements that better capture the geometries, the true geometries of our domain, as you can see the yellow elements here in the figure. And then, differently from most of the other immersed methods on the state of the art, we don't want to integrate over the cut cells that are the elements cut by the true lines of our geometry, but rather impose the boundary condition on the boundary of our new computational domain, that is the red boundary here in the figure, that will be called surrogate boundary, by means of Taylor expansion from this boundary to the closest point on the true boundary, where the boundary conditions are known. Well, this method has several advantages. First of all, it's easy to implement. It retains optimal convergence, at least for the Dirichlet boundary conditions, and most importantly, doesn't suffer from the small cut cell instability, which is a typical issue of most of the other immersed methods that produces very high condition number in most of the cases. Well, we can see some results of the shifted boundary method for structural and fluid problems inside the Kratos multiphysics software for both two-dimensional and three-dimensional problems. In this case, we were able to have optimal convergence in all of the cases for the Dirichlet boundary conditions. As I said, the main problem of the shifter boundary method by now is the application to non-boundary conditions. In this case, in fact, we will have to Taylor expand gradient-like operators. For them, in fact, we will have only p minus 1 derivative availables, and we will be able to perform the Taylor expansion only up to one order less of accuracy compared to what we were doing for the Dirichlet-like term, so for which we had that additional derivatives available. This, of course, will lead to suboptimal convergences in numerical studies compared to Dirichlet boundary in the case of Dirichlet boundary conditions or standard body-fitted codes. And the question is there a possible solution up to now? Well, the short answer is yes, we can use mixed formulations, that is, introduce the degrees of freedom also for the strains, or in general the derivatives of our unknowns in our computations, in order to have that additional derivative available. Or the recent possibility that has been tested in the past months is the use of local refinement, in particular H or P refinement, to either reduce the distances of the projections or to locally degree elevate the basis functions active in the Neumann boundary regions to have an approximation of that additional derivative that we need for the Taylor expansion. Well, let's see now some application of the shifter boundary method in quantum mechanics problems by starting, first of all, with a single background mesh and objects that are already in contact from the beginning of the simulation. So small deformations and small displacements. We will introduce two shift operators for both the displacement fields and the stress field. And following the concept of the shifter boundary method, we can impose the boundary conditions on both the active part and the inactive part of the boundary of the contact by means of these shift operators. So we can see some applications, for example, with the classical Hertz problem of a deformable cylinder pressed against an undeformable barrier, and we will compare the solution obtained with 6 different meshes with a standard FEM code and 6 different meshes with the shifter boundary method, both with the mixed formulation, so with the degrees of freedom for the strains, and a primary formulation with just the degrees of freedom for the displacement field. So this is the convergence path of the standard body-fitted FEM approach. The black line is the analytical solution. And these are the results obtained with the mixed and primal formulation for the shifter boundary method. Surprisingly, also the primal formulation was able to achieve very good results and actually converge even faster to an analytical solution than the mixed SBM formulation. This was surprising, as I said, because what we were observing for Neumann boundary condition was a suboptimal convergence to the analytical solution for the displacement field. But we discovered that actually the convergence for the stress field, or in general for the derivatives of the solution, actually performs very well even for the application on Neumann boundary conditions. And in fact, contact conditions, the conditions for the contact are not so different from the condition on Neumann boundaries. So this is the final comparison of all the 3 methods with the final mesh, and we were quite happy because we were able to achieve a final relative error on the maximum contact stress, which was below the 1% for all of the methods. Well, we were able also to extend this method to more complex geometries and even 3-dimensional ones obtained from STL files, but still this was just a preliminary test because, as I said, this can only work for bodies that are already in contact and is limited to small deformations and small displacements. This is why we try to move to more complex scenarios where the objects are in general not in contact from the beginning of the simulations, are described by 2 different meshes, 2 different background meshes, as you can see in the figure, in order to have an environment that will be suitable for large displacements and large deformations. So we can start with a simple example with two circle, that is the case of two cylinders. The problem here is that we need to be able to connect the points of the two geometries that are now described by two different meshes, so two different set of degrees of freedom. This, in this case, works by a three-step projection. That is, we will start from the true boundary of one of the two objects that we will call the master object, master domain, and project the boundary conditions, the values of the stresses and displacements to the closest point on the surrogate boundary of that domain. Then we will find the closest point on the true boundary of the other object that we will call slave domain, and that will be eventually put in contact with the first one, and finally project again the values of the stresses and displacements from the true boundary of the second domain to the surrogate boundary of that second domain. Finally, we will impose the boundary conditions, always following the same concept of the shifter boundary method by means of shift operators based on Taylor expansion. So, okay, we can see the application to the two most typical problems, Hertz problems. So, a deformable cylinder pressed against the wall and two deformable cylinders pressed against each other. And we were quite happy because for linear basis functions, we were able to achieve optimal convergence in terms of the contact stress, so the stress on the contact boundary. We also applied it for more complex geometries which are not in general not in contact from the beginning and that may have more than one contact region. So in this case, we consider these two geometries and move the left geometry little by little to the right and fix the B-shaped geometry on the right side. And we were quite happy because the software was able to correctly identify the two contact regions and had very similar results compared to a standard FEM code, but with way more coarser meshes. So the only problem that we experienced was that with higher order basis functions, for example, quadratic basis functions, the algorithm seemed to have some issues. It was at the moment it diverged from the analytical solution, but we connected this problem to a more general issue connected to the shifter boundary method and Neumann discontinuities. So Neumann boundary conditions that present discontinuities, so for example jumps as in the case of the contact for higher order basis functions, and this is still an open field of study. So some recent developments are the application of the shifter boundary method on local refinement, the application of local refinement by means of hierarchical B-splines to the shifter boundary method that hopefully will be presented in next videos, and the use of a new concept of the shifter boundary method formulation that also tries to integrate on the cut cells, let's say, by means of Taylor expansion of the basis function from the interior elements. So without the activation of new degrees of freedom, that was exactly the issue that was leading to small cut cell instabilities to all the others immerse methods. So finally, let's move to the conclusion. So the shifter boundary method has proven to be a very stable and high performance immersed approach for IGA for any order for the initial boundary conditions, but with suboptimal convergence in the case of Neumann boundary conditions. For contact problems with a predefined interface of contact, the SBM maintains the same convergence rate and accuracy of the body fit discretization, so no loss of accuracy. And for general contact, it's able to perform very well for linear basis functions, but still has some issues for higher order basis functions. Finally, we we hope to be able to achieve better results with the application of this new formulation of the SBM that is called the gap SBM formulation on contact problems that hopefully will be applied in the next months, and the use of local refinement techniques. Well, this was all. So thank you for your attention. And if you are interested, you may check out the main results on two published papers um, on Semame. So yeah, this was all. Thank you. Thank you all for the attention.